When experienced hiker James Crawford reaches the summit of Mount Revere after a grueling 8-hour climb through dense fog, he expects to find the usual reward of breathtaking views and personal satisfaction. Instead, he discovers something that defies all logic and reason. Sitting perfectly preserved on the rocky peak, as if it had been gently placed there by invisible hands, is a complete World War II Sherman tank. No tire tracks lead to this impossible location. No helicopter landing zone exists on this jagged summit. No roads have ever been carved into these treacherous slopes. Yet here it sits, its olive drab paint barely weathered, its treads still packed with mud from some distant battlefield. James approaches the machine with the caution of a man who has spent 40 years reading the wilderness for signs of danger. But how do you prepare for something that simply cannot exist? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. James stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his mind struggling to process what his eyes reported. The fog swirled around the tank like curious spirits, occasionally parting, to reveal details that made the situation even more impossible. The Sherman tank, he recognized it as an M4A3E8. From his father's war stories, sat perfectly level on ground that sloped in every direction. Its tracks rested on bare granite that showed no signs of disturbance, no gouges or scrapes that should mark the passage of 30 tons of steel. The metal looked pristine, not the corroded wreck one might expect after decades of mountain weather. James approached slowly, his hiking boots crunching on loose scree that seemed unnaturally loud in the absolute silence. The tank's hull number read 347 in regulation white stencil, and below it, someone had chalked "Mountain Ghost" in letters that looked fresh, despite the impossibility of recent human presence at this elevation. The commander's hatch stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness within. As James circled the machine, he noticed other details that deepened the mystery. The rubber track pads appeared intact, showing wear patterns consistent with use, but not abandonment. The periscopes and vision blocks were clear, not fogged or cracked as they should be after exposure to mountain conditions. Most unsettling was the warmth radiating from the hull. James placed his palm against the armor plating and jerked back in surprise. The metal felt warm, as if the engine had been running recently. In the thin air at 8,147 feet, with temperatures hovering near freezing, warm metal suggested recent operation. But how? There was no fuel depot on this mountain, no maintenance facility, no conceivable way for a tank to operate at this location. James checked his GPS coordinates 3 times, confirming he stood on the summit of Mount Revere. This was definitely the peak he'd attempted twice before, the same mountain he'd studied from every angle for 27 years of hiking in this region. A sound emerged from within the tank, faint but unmistakable. The rhythmic clicking of mechanical equipment, like an old telegraph key or relay switch. James leaned closer to the open hatch, straining to identify the source. The clicking continued at precise intervals, accompanied by a low electrical hum that had no business existing on a remote mountain peak. He pulled out his camera, then hesitated. Who would believe photographs? In an age of digital manipulation, even video evidence carried little weight without context. And what context could possibly explain this? The fog began thickening again, as if the mountain wanted to hide its secret. James realized he had perhaps 30 minutes of visibility before the summit disappeared back into its shroud of grey nothingness. He needed to document what he could and make decisions about his next course of action. James walked to where the summit register should be mounted, a weathered metal box containing a logbook for hikers to sign. The box was there, bolted to a granite outcrop exactly where it should be. But when he opened it, the logbook inside was completely blank. Not just empty of recent entries, but pristine, as if it had never been touched by human hands. This detail troubled him almost as much as the tank itself. James had climbed dozens of peaks in this range, and summit registers always contained years of entries from other hikers. Names, dates, brief comments about weather conditions and climbing experiences. The blank register suggested something was interfering with normal human activity on this mountain. The clicking from the tank grew louder, more insistent. James found himself drawn back to the open hatch, curiosity overcoming caution. The sound seemed almost like communication, a pattern that suggested intelligence rather than random mechanical operation. He checked his altimeter, his GPS, his compass, all the instruments that had guided him safely through decades of mountain climbing. Everything confirmed his location and elevation. He was definitely on Mount Revere's summit, definitely at the coordinates he'd planned to reach. But none of his experience, none of his training, none of his scientific education had prepared him for this moment. The tank sat in the swirling fog, like a monument to impossibility, its warm hull radiating mysteries that challenged everything James thought he knew about reality, whatever explanation existed for its presence. He was certain it would transform his understanding of what was possible in this world. As the fog closed in completely, obscuring the tank and leaving James alone with his racing thoughts, one certainty emerged from his confusion. He would be returning to this mountain tomorrow with better equipment and more time to investigate. Some discoveries, he realized, demanded everything a person could give them. James knew he should leave. Every instinct developed through 40 years of wilderness experience screamed for retreat to safer ground before the weather deteriorated further. But the mechanical clicking from inside the tank had evolved into something that sounded almost like Morse code. Deliberate, patterned, insistent. He approached the commander's hatch with the caution of a man who had learned to respect the unknown. The opening was just wide enough for him to peer inside, and what he saw defied every expectation he might have formed about the tank's interior. The crew compartment appeared pristine, as if the soldiers had stepped out moments ago for a smoke break. 5 sets of military uniforms occupied their positions, not empty, but filled with forms that created perfect human silhouettes. James could see boots, gloves, helmets positioned exactly as they would be worn, yet no bodies filled these clothes. Personal items scattered throughout the compartment told stories of interrupted lives. A half-eaten K-ration sat beside the gunner's position. An unfinished letter lay folded near the loader's seat, a photograph of a young woman visible through the translucent paper. A baseball, signed by someone named Mickey, rested in a net bag hanging from the turret wall. The uniforms bore unit patches James recognized from his father's war memorabilia. The 761st Tank Battalion. The Black Panthers who had fought their way across Europe in 1944 and 1945. His father had spoken of them with deep respect, one of the first African-American armored units to see combat. Men who had proven their courage on battlefields from France to Germany, but these uniforms looked wrong for 1945. The fabric appeared too fresh, the colors too vibrant. Even stored in perfect conditions, military clothing should show some deterioration after 8 decades. These looked as if they had been issued yesterday. The radio equipment hummed with activity that should have been impossible. James counted at least 3 different generations of communication technology. The original 1940s radio set, modern digital displays showing incomprehensible data, and something that looked like Victorian science fiction, brass and copper mechanisms covered in switches and dials. A voice emerged from the radio speakers, young and professional, with the clipped accent of wartime military communication. Mountain Ghost to base. We have reached objective coordinates 47.22153. 1.31.1534. Mission parameters achieved. Awaiting further orders. James checked his GPS. The coordinates matched the summit's exact position. The transmission repeated after a 30-second pause, then again. James realized he was hearing a message broadcast on endless loop, a cry for help that had been repeating for God knew how long. The thought sent chills through him that had nothing to do with the mountain's cold air. A logbook lay open beside the radio equipment, filled with entries in different handwriting. The final entry, dated 3 days ago in neat cursive, read, Day 28, 847 of displacement. Radio contact with base remains impossible. Crew status unchanged. Food supplies infinite but unappetizing. We are beginning to understand that our mission was not what we were told. James read backward through the entries, his hands shaking slightly. The dates worked through decades: 2023, 2015, 1987, 1962, ending with the first entry dated April 15th, 1945. Operation Mountain Phase initiated. Arrived at coordinates as ordered. Awaiting contact with Advanced Research Team. Something feels wrong about this place. A photograph pinned to the tank's wall showed 5 young men in military dress uniforms, their faces bright with the confidence of soldiers who believed their cause was just. Below the photo, someone had written in fading ink, Crew of Mountain Ghost, displaced but not forgotten. Private Robert Johnson, age 19. Corporal Marcus Williams, age 22. Sergeant David Thompson, age 24. Private Thomas Anderson, age 20. Tank Commander Lieutenant James Washington, age 26, all younger than his own children. All volunteers who had thought they were serving their country in its final push toward victory. The radio crackled with a new voice, older and more tired than the first. Day 28, 848. We have observed a civilian on the summit. Temporal protocols suggest we should not interact. But after 79 years, the temptation for human contact grows overwhelming. James jerked back from the tank as if shocked. The voice continued, Sir, if you can hear this transmission, please know that we are not hostile. We are soldiers who accepted a mission we did not fully understand. We have been trying to return home for 8 decades. The implications hit James like a physical blow. These weren't recordings or echoes from the past. Somewhere, somehow, 5 young soldiers were alive and conscious, trapped in this impossible situation, counting days that had stretched into decades. Sir, the voice continued, if you choose to help us return tomorrow, our time is running out, and yours maybe as well. James descended through the fog in a state of controlled shock, his methodical nature taking over while his mind struggled to process what he'd witnessed. Check equipment, monitor route, maintain safe pace. The familiar rituals of descent helped ground him in reality. But which reality? The one where tanks couldn't materialize on mountain peaks, or the one where 5 young soldiers had been trapped in time for 8 decades? At tree line, he stopped to make notes in his field journal, his usually precise handwriting wavering as he documented the impossible. Temperature readings, GPS coordinates, equipment observations, all the concrete data that might convince someone else, or more importantly, might convince himself that he hadn't suffered some kind of altitude-induced breakdown. By the time he reached his truck at the base camp, darkness had settled over the mountains. James sat with the engine running for warmth and pulled out his cell phone. 1 bar of signal strength, barely enough for conversation, but sufficient for the call he needed to make. Sarah, it's Dad. I know it's late, but I need to ask you something about Grandpa's war service. He paused, listening to his daughter's voice 3 states away. The 761st Tank Battalion. You helped him organize his papers before he died. Do you remember anything about Operation Mountain Phase? Sarah Crawford Martinez, his eldest daughter and a military historian at the University of Colorado, sounded tired but interested. Dad, are you working on another research project? I thought you were enjoying retirement from academic life, just following up on something I came across today. Probably nothing, but you know how I am about details. Let me check his files. I digitized everything when we cleaned out his house, remember? Give me a minute to search. James waited, watching the mountain disappear into darkness above him. Somewhere up there in fog and impossibility, 5 soldiers continued their endless vigil. The thought made him shiver despite the truck's heater. Dad, this is strange. I have a reference to Operation Mountain Phase, but most of the document is heavily redacted. Classified material from 1945. Something about temporal research applications and strategic displacement protocols. The file mentions university physicists working with the military on advanced theoretical concepts. Temporal research? In 1945, I know it sounds far-fetched, but apparently the military was investigating all kinds of advanced concepts near the end of the war. Jet engines, radar, rocket technology, nuclear weapons, and apparently some theoretical physics that sounds like science fiction. Dad, why are you asking about this specific operation? James considered how much to reveal. I found something on the mountain today, something that doesn't make conventional sense. Can you email me whatever files you have? Of course, but Dad, you sound strange. Are you okay? You didn't fall or injure yourself, did you? The genuine concern in her voice reminded James how this must sound. A retired professor, alone on a mountain, asking about classified military experiments from 8 decades ago. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just curious about something I discovered. Send me what you can, and maybe I'll contact Dr. Peterson tomorrow. The physics professor from your old university? Dad, what exactly did you find up there? Probably nothing. But if it turns out to be something significant, I want to understand it properly before I make any decisions. After ending the call, James drove home through winding mountain roads, his mind working through possibilities he would have dismissed as impossible 24 hours earlier. His house, a modest cabin built in the 1970s, had served as his retreat from academic life for the past 5 years. Tonight, it felt like a sanctuary where logical thought might prevail over impossible experiences. His laptop chimed with an incoming email from Sarah as he settled into his study. The attachment contained 17 pages of military documents, most heavily redacted, but containing enough information to confirm his worst fears. Operation Mountain Phase had been real. The documents described experiments in temporal displacement for strategic advantage and field testing of theoretical physics applications in combat. Scenarios. Names were blacked out, but locations were specified. Testing sites in remote mountains across the American West, chosen for their isolation and specific atmospheric conditions. One memo, dated March 1945, discussed successful displacement of test, subjects into forward temporal positions, and unexpected challenges in retrieval protocols. Another referenced volunteer units selected for extended displacement missions with full knowledge of experimental nature. The final document, stamped Mission Terminated, Retrieval Impossible, was dated May 8, 1945, the day. Someone had ended the operation exactly when the war in Europe concluded, abandoning whatever test subjects remained displaced. James found references to Dr. Marcus Heidelberg, a theoretical physicist who had escaped Nazi Germany in 1938 and joined the American war effort. Heidelberg's theories about temporal manipulation using atmospheric electromagnetic field generation formed the scientific basis for Mountain Phase. A single photograph had escaped the redaction process. 5 young African-American soldiers standing beside a Sherman tank, their faces bright with confidence and purpose. The caption read, 761st Battalion Volunteers for Extended Reconnaissance Mission, April 1945. James recognized the faces from the photograph inside the tank. James made coffee and called Dr. Elizabeth Peterson's home number at midnight. Despite being 73, Elizabeth kept researcher's hours and answered on the second ring with the alertness of someone accustomed to late-night scientific discussions. Jim, do you realize what time it is? Beth, I need to ask you about something that's going to sound completely insane. Temporal displacement theory. Specifically, using atmospheric conditions to create stable time loops. Are you working on a science fiction novel? Because temporal displacement is theoretically possible under very specific conditions, but practically impossible with any technology we've ever developed, or that existed in the 1940s for that matter. What if someone had actually attempted it during the war? What if there were classified experiments that most people never heard about? Dr. Peterson's voice sharpened with scientific interest. There were rumors in academic circles after the war Heidelberg's work, some classified projects that got shut down when Germany surrendered. Theoretical physicists who disappeared from university positions and were never heard from again. Why are you asking about this, Jim? James described his discovery, without mentioning the tank directly, just a hypothetical situation where evidence of temporal displacement might be discovered on a remote mountain. Dr. Peterson listened with the patience of someone accustomed to thought experiments and theoretical discussions. If such an experiment had actually occurred, she said finally, the subjects would likely be trapped in what we call a closed time-like curve. They would experience time normally from their perspective, but their position in space-time would be fixed relative to specific atmospheric and electromagnetic conditions, meaning they could be conscious and aging, but unable to return to their original time period? Exactly. The energy requirements for creating such a displacement would be enormous, but maintaining it might require relatively little power if the initial conditions were perfectly calibrated. The subjects might remain conscious for decades, experiencing normal subjective time while being isolated from the natural flow of temporal events. James felt his stomach clench as Dr. Peterson's theoretical description matched exactly what he'd witnessed on the mountain. How would you reverse such a displacement? You'd need to recreate the exact conditions that caused the initial displacement, then provide enough concentrated energy to break the temporal loop and return the subjects to normal spacetime. In the 1940s, that would have been completely impossible. Today, with the right equipment and a thorough understanding of the original displacement parameters, it might be theoretically achievable. What kind of equipment would be required? High-powered electromagnetic field generators, atmospheric manipulation technology, and someone with enough theoretical knowledge to calibrate the reversal sequence properly. Plus, an enormous energy source concentrated in a very short time period. Natural lightning would be ideal if you could harness and direct it effectively. Dr. Peterson paused, and James could hear her moving around what he knew was her cluttered home laboratory. Jim, are you actually investigating something real? Because if you've discovered evidence of temporal displacement, this could revolutionize our understanding of physics. I'm not sure yet. But if I had discovered something like this, what would be the risks of attempting a reversal? Catastrophic if done incorrectly. You could stabilize the loop permanently, making reversal impossible. You could cause a temporal cascade that affects a much larger area than the original displacement. Or you could succeed perfectly and restore the subjects to their proper timeline. What about the consequences for the surrounding area? Unknown. Temporal displacement theory suggests that any major interference with a closed time-like curve could have unpredictable effects on local space-time. Weather patterns, electromagnetic fields, even geological stability could be affected. James reached for a leather-bound journal that had belonged to his grandfather, a mining engineer who had worked in these mountains in the 1930s, hidden between pages of survey notes. He'd found something that hadn't seemed important until tonight. Hand-copied excerpts from technical papers by Dr. Marcus Heidelberg, dated 1944. The journal contained detailed diagrams of electromagnetic field configurations and atmospheric manipulation techniques. Notes in his grandfather's careful handwriting described government. Scientists asking questions about isolated mountain peaks and strange electrical equipment being transported to remote locations. Beth, I think my grandfather might have been involved in the original experiment somehow. I have his journal with notes about Heidelberg's work and references to government activities in these mountains. That would make sense. The military would have needed local expertise for site selection and logistics. Mining engineers would understand the geological and atmospheric conditions required for this kind of experiment. If I decided to attempt a temporal displacement reversal, would you help me? The line was quiet for a long moment. Jim, are you telling me you've actually found displaced subjects? I'm telling you that 5 young soldiers might need our help to get home. The next morning, James arrived at the university physics building, carrying his grandfather's journal and the weight of a sleepless night. Dr. Peterson waited in her laboratory, surrounded by equipment that represented decades of theoretical physics research. Electromagnetic field generators, quantum mechanics computers and devices James couldn't identify filled the space with a low electronic hum. "Jim, you look exhausted. And you're carrying what appears to be a 1940s engineering journal. Either you've discovered something extraordinary or you've had some kind of breakdown." James placed the journal and military documents on her workbench. "I found them, Beth. The displaced soldiers from Operation Mountain Phase, they're alive, conscious, trapped in a temporal loop on Mount Revere, and they have less than 48 hours before their return window closes permanently." Dr. Peterson examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who had spent 50 years separating scientific fact from speculation. Her expression shifted from skepticism to fascination, to concern as she read through the classified materials and studied the technical diagrams in the journal. These documents reference Heidelberg's theoretical work directly. "I've studied his papers for decades. Brilliant but incredibly dangerous applications of quantum mechanics and space-time manipulation. If someone actually implemented his temporal displacement protocol..." She trailed off, calculations running behind her eyes. "You believe it's possible?" "Not just possible, inevitable, given the right conditions and equipment." Heidelberg theorized that certain atmospheric phenomena, combined with specific electromagnetic frequencies and geological conditions, could create stable temporal loops. The mathematics are sound, but the energy requirements seemed impossible in 1945. She pulled up weather monitoring data on her computer, showing atmospheric pressure readings and electromagnetic field measurements from stations throughout the region. James watched incomprehensible graphs and wave patterns fill the screen. "Look at this, Jim. The atmospheric conditions around Mount Revere show anomalous patterns going back decades. Unusual electromagnetic readings, barometric pressure variations that don't match regional weather systems, and persistent localized fog formations that defy meteorological explanation." Her weather monitoring equipment, sophisticated devices that measured electromagnetic fields and atmospheric disturbances, revealed patterns James had never noticed during his years of climbing in the region. The data showed that Mount Revere existed in its own microclimate, isolated from normal weather systems by forces that shouldn't exist in nature. "The temporal displacement is affecting local weather patterns," Dr. Peterson continued, studying readouts that meant nothing to James, but clearly excited her scientific imagination. 79 years of temporal energy buildup has to go somewhere. It's been gradually altering electromagnetic fields and atmospheric conditions throughout the entire mountain range. Is that why the fog appears at specific times? Exactly. The temporal loop creates its own atmospheric conditions to maintain stability. But it's also building toward some kind of release point. The energy has to discharge eventually, and when it does, the effects could be catastrophic for the entire region. James studied weather predictions on another monitor, watching a major storm system tracking toward their location. "There's a severe storm approaching Mount Revere tomorrow night. Is that connected to the temporal displacement?" "Almost certainly. The timing can't be coincidental. 79 years of accumulated temporal energy, reaching critical mass just as a natural electrical storm provides the perfect discharge mechanism." Dr. Peterson began assembling equipment with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades working with complex scientific instruments. Electromagnetic field generators disguised as radio equipment, atmospheric monitoring devices, and specialized electronics that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. If we're going to attempt a temporal displacement reversal, we need to harness the storm's electrical energy and channel it into breaking the closed time-like curve. The natural lightning will provide the power source we need, but controlling and directing that energy will require precise calibration. How dangerous is this going to be? For the soldiers, For us, and potentially for everyone within a 50-mile radius if we miscalculate. Temporal displacement isn't a precise science. Jim, we could succeed brilliantly, fail catastrophically, or create a temporal anomaly that affects the entire region's relationship with normal space-time. James watched her work, assembling devices that bridge theoretical physics and practical engineering. The monitoring equipment revealed the full scope of what they were attempting, not just rescuing 5 soldiers, but potentially preventing a temporal catastrophe that had been building for 8 decades. The storm will hit Mount Revere tomorrow night, Dr. Peterson said, checking final weather updates. That gives us exactly 24 hours to reach the summit, establish our equipment, and execute a successful temporal displacement reversal during the peak electrical activity. And if we fail, the temporal energy discharges catastrophically instead of channeling into the return sequence. The soldiers experience rapid aging as they live through all 79 years simultaneously. And we probably trigger electromagnetic effects that disrupt technology throughout the region for decades. James realized they weren't just attempting a rescue mission, they were trying to prevent a disaster that could affect thousands of people. That evening, James sat in his study, going through his father's military effects for the 3rd time, looking for anything that might connect his family more directly to the 761st Tank Battalion. His father had been reluctant to discuss the war during James's childhood, sharing only fragments of stories about courage under fire and bonds forged in combat. In a wooden box that had sat unopened since his father's funeral 5 years earlier, James found what he was looking for. Wrapped in tissue paper, nestled beneath discharge papers and campaign ribbons, was a Bronze Star medal with an accompanying citation. The official language was typical military bureaucracy, but one line made James's breath catch: for extraordinary heroism during joint operations with the 761st Tank Battalion in support of classified strategic objectives. April 1945, his father had been there. Sergeant William Crawford, combat engineer, had participated in whatever operation had sent 5 young tank crew members into temporal displacement. The medal's citation was dated April 16, 1945, one day after the first entry in the displaced crew's logbook. James examined the back of the medal, finding an inscription he'd never noticed before: "To Bill, from the guys who didn't make it home when they should have. Thanks for trying. Mountain Ghost Crew." The personal message, engraved in script that looked hand-done rather than machine-made, suggested his father had maintained some kind of contact with the displaced soldiers over the years. James and Dr. Peterson began their ascent at 4 a.m., headlamps cutting through pre-dawn darkness as they navigated the familiar trail with packs loaded heavier than James had ever carried. The electromagnetic field generators, disguised as radio equipment, added 30 pounds to their load. Weather monitoring devices, emergency medical supplies, and climbing gear rated for extreme conditions filled every available space in their packs. Dr. Peterson, despite her 73 years and primarily academic lifestyle, moved with determined efficiency up the lower slopes. Her physical preparation for this climb had been minimal, but her intellectual preparation was absolute. She understood exactly what they were attempting and what would be required for success. "The atmospheric readings are already showing anomalies," she said, checking her handheld devices as they climbed through the forest. "Electromagnetic field strength is increasing as we gain elevation, and the barometric pressure patterns don't match regional weather data." James consulted his father's hand-drawn map, locating the first equipment cache at 6,200 feet. Hidden beneath a carefully constructed rock cairn, they found supplies his father had placed decades earlier: additional climbing rope, emergency food rations, and most importantly, a waterproof case containing backup electromagnetic equipment designed in the 1940s but never deployed. "Your father was thorough," Dr. Peterson observed, examining the vintage equipment. "This looks like original Heidelberg designs, but modified for field deployment." If our modern equipment fails, these might provide essential backup capability. The emergency radio beacon James carried for safety began malfunctioning as they climbed above 7,000 feet. The device, which should have provided reliable emergency communication, started broadcasting intermittent static and fragmented transmissions that seemed to come from decades in the past. The temporal field is interfering with modern electronics, Dr. Peterson explained, watching her own equipment experience similar problems. As we get closer to the displacement zone, anything with digital circuits becomes unreliable. We'll need to rely on analog instruments and manual calculations for the final approach. James found this strangely reassuring. His decades of mountain climbing had taught him to depend on compass, altimeter, and weather sense rather than electronic devices. The mountain was reverting them to older, more fundamental ways of navigation and survival. At 7,800 feet, the fog began forming around them despite clear weather predictions. The mist appeared from nowhere, rising from valleys that should have been too warm to generate such atmospheric conditions. Within minutes, visibility dropped to 20 feet in any direction. "This is it," Dr. Peterson said, checking readings that fluctuated wildly on her instruments. "We're entering the temporal displacement field. Everything from here up exists in altered space-time." The temperature began dropping noticeably, not from altitude, but from something more fundamental. James could feel the wrongness in the air, a sensation like standing too close to high-voltage power lines, but more profound. The very atmosphere around them seemed charged with energy that had no natural source. They continued climbing through increasingly thick fog, following GPS coordinates that became less reliable with each step. James navigated by dead reckoning and terrain features he'd memorized from previous climbs, while Dr. Peterson monitored equipment that provided more questions than answers. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts," she reported, voice muffled by the unnatural mist. "Whatever created the original displacement is still active and building towards some kind of discharge point." At 8,400 feet, James's radio beacon failed completely. Its screen displaying error messages in languages that didn't exist. Dr. Peterson's atmospheric monitoring equipment showed similar malfunctions, digital displays cycling through impossible readings before shutting down entirely. "We're on our own from here," James said, securing the failed equipment in his pack. "No GPS, no radio contact, no electronic backup. Just compass, altimeter, and experience." "Actually, that might be preferable," Dr. Peterson replied, examining her few remaining analog instruments. "Modern electronics can't function properly in this level of temporal distortion. We'll have better luck with mechanical devices and direct observation." As they approached the technical climbing section below the summit, James could hear something that made his heart race, the distant sound of voices calling through the fog. Not the radio transmissions from the tank, but human voices calling for help, direction, contact with the outside world. The displaced soldiers had detected their approach and were trying to guide them to the summit through the temporal maze that surrounded their position. 5 young men who had been waiting 79 years for rescue were finally about to receive the help they desperately needed. James secured his climbing rope and began the final technical approach. Knowing that somewhere above them in the swirling fog, 5 American soldiers were counting on their success. James and Dr. Peterson reached the summit just as the fog began to part, revealing the impossible sight that had haunted James's thoughts for the past 2 days. The Sherman tank sat exactly where he'd found it, but now voices called out from within, real, human voices speaking with the accent and terminology of 1940s American soldiers. "Mountain ghost crew to approaching personnel," came a clear transmission from the tank's radio. "We have visual contact with 2 civilians at coordinates 47.2153. On time 21:15 to 34 request. Confirmation of identity and mission parameters." Dr. Peterson stared at the tank with the expression of someone watching theoretical physics become concrete reality. Her laptop computer, one of the few electronic devices still functioning at this altitude, displayed real-time data about temporal field fluctuations that defied every scientific principle she'd studied for 50 years. This is Dr. Elizabeth Peterson, theoretical physicist from the University of Washington, she called toward the tank. I'm accompanied by James Crawford, son of Sergeant William Crawford, who participated in your original deployment. We're here to attempt temporal displacement reversal. The response came immediately, filled with emotion that had been building for 79 years. Dr. Peterson, sir, this is Lieutenant James Washington, Tank Commander. We've been monitoring your approach through our perimeter sensors. Please confirm you're here to bring us home. That's our intention, Lieutenant. But we need to understand your current status and the technical parameters of your displacement before we can proceed. Dr. Peterson's laptop showed scrolling data that revealed the true scope of what they faced. Temporal field strength measurements, electromagnetic readings, and atmospheric disturbance patterns painted a picture of reality bent beyond normal limits. The mountain summit existed in a bubble of altered space-time that had been stable for nearly 8 decades. Ma'am, we've been displaced for 48 days as of this morning, Lieutenant Washington replied. Crew status is stable but deteriorating. We experience normal time flow, but remain isolated from natural temporal progression. Food and water supplies refresh automatically, but psychological strain is becoming critical. James approached the tank cautiously, noting details that had escaped his attention during his first visit. The vehicle's positioning wasn't random. It sat at the exact center of a natural depression in the granite summit, placed with precision that suggested careful surveying and preparation. Lieutenant, this is James Crawford. My father was the engineer who helped prepare your deployment site. He spent 40 years trying to find a way to bring you home. Mr. Crawford, sir, your father was a good man who tried to warn us about the experimental nature of our mission. We volunteered anyway because we believed it would help end the war. Tell me, did our sacrifice serve any useful purpose? The question hung in the thin mountain air, weighted with decades of doubt and isolation. James exchanged glances with Dr. Peterson before responding. The war ended 3 weeks after your displacement, Lieutenant. Victory in Europe came on May 8, 1945. Your willingness to volunteer for dangerous duty was part of the courage that brought peace. Thank you, sir. That knowledge helps. Now, what do you need from us to execute the temporal reversal? Dr. Peterson consulted her laptop, watching data streams that showed the temporal displacement reaching critical instability. We need to understand the original displacement parameters and coordinate your cooperation with our reversal sequence. The approaching storm will provide the energy source we need, but timing will be crucial. Ma'am, we have complete records of the original displacement event. Dr. Heidelberg's equipment is still operational inside our vehicle, and we've maintained detailed logs of all temporal fluctuations since April 1945. We can provide whatever technical data you require. The tank's commander's hatch opened, and James caught his first glimpse of the displaced crew. 5 young faces, unchanged by the decades, but marked by the strain of unimaginable isolation, looked out at their potential rescuers with expressions of hope tempered by caution. Gentlemen, Dr. Peterson said formally, I need to explain the risks. This procedure could succeed completely, fail catastrophically, or create temporal anomalies that affect far more than your immediate situation. If you choose to proceed, you must understand that we cannot guarantee your safety. Dr. Peterson, Lieutenant Washington replied, we've been dead to the world for 79 years. Our families buried empty coffins and moved on with their lives. Whatever risks we face can't be worse than spending eternity trapped in this place, Private Johnson. The youngest of the crew at 19 spoke for the first time. Ma'am, will our families know we made it home? Will they understand what happened to us? Dr. Peterson's laptop showed increasing temporal instability as the approaching storm began affecting atmospheric conditions around the summit. They had perhaps 6 hours before the displacement. Field reached critical mass and either facilitated Their rescue or discharged catastrophically. James and Dr. Peterson worked with methodical urgency to position their equipment around the tank as storm. Clouds gathered overhead with unnatural rapidity. The electromagnetic field generators, disguised as radio equipment but containing sophisticated physics laboratory components, required precise placement to channel the approaching lightning strikes into a controlled temporal reversal sequence. Dr. Peterson assembled her improvised lightning rod array with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades working with experimental equipment. Copper conductors, electromagnetic field concentrators, and grounding cables formed a complex web around the tank's position, designed to capture and direct natural electrical energy into breaking the closed time-like curve that held the crew prisoner. "The positioning has to be exact," she explained to James as they secured the array to the granite summit. "We need to create a controlled electromagnetic pulse that matches the frequency signature of the original displacement field, but inverted to facilitate return rather than displacement." Lieutenant Washington and his crew provided technical assistance from inside the tank, reading parameters from Dr. Heidelberg's original equipment and coordinating with Dr. Peterson's modern instruments. The cooperation between 1940s science and 2024 technology created an unprecedented fusion of theoretical physics across 8 decades. Dr. Peterson, Lieutenant Washington called from the tank. "Heidelberg's temporal field generator shows increasing instability in the displacement matrix. The storm is affecting our containment field strength. That's exactly what we need," Dr. Peterson replied, monitoring readings on equipment that fluctuated wildly as atmospheric pressure dropped and electrical activity increased overhead. "The storm will provide the energy pulse necessary to break your temporal loop, but we have to time the reversal sequence perfectly." James secured grounding cables to natural rock formations while watching the sky transform above them. The approaching storm showed characteristics he'd never seen in 40 years of mountain climbing: lightning that formed geometric patterns, clouds that moved against prevailing winds, electrical discharges that seemed to respond to the electromagnetic equipment rather than following natural atmospheric processes. "This isn't a normal weather system," he observed, watching lightning strikes that occurred in precise intervals rather than random patterns. "The temporal displacement has been affecting regional weather for decades, and now it's all coming to a head. The accumulated temporal energy has to discharge somehow," Dr. Peterson explained, calibrating her instruments as electrical activity intensified. "For 79 years, the displacement field has been building pressure in local space-time. The storm is the natural result of that pressure reaching critical mass." The lightning rod array began responding to the increasing electrical activity, generating low-frequency hums and occasional sparks that indicated successful energy capture. Dr. Peterson's electromagnetic field generators powered up automatically as the storm provided the energy source they needed for the temporal reversal. "Attempt, crew positions, report status." Lieutenant Washington called to his men inside the tank. "Gunner ready?" came Corporal Williams's voice. "Loader ready." Private Anderson responded. "Driver ready?" Private Thompson confirmed. "Assistant driver ready?" Private Johnson added, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Dr. Peterson's equipment showed the temporal field approaching critical instability as lightning strikes increased in frequency and intensity around the summit. The lightning rod array channeled each electrical discharge into her electromagnetic field generators, building the energy reservoir needed for the temporal reversal sequence. "James, I need you to monitor the grounding cables," Dr. Peterson instructed, her voice raised over the increasing wind and electrical activity. "If any of the connections failed during the reversal sequence, the energy discharge could kill all of us and create a temporal anomaly that affects the entire region." James checked each grounding point, ensuring solid connections between the lightning rod array and the granite bedrock. The mountain itself became part of their equipment, providing the electrical ground necessary to safely channel massive amounts of natural energy into controlled temporal manipulation. "Dr. Peterson," Lieutenant Washington called urgently. "Heidelberg's equipment shows temporal field collapse initiating prematurely. The storm is forcing events faster than our original timeline." "Understood, Lieutenant. We're moving to immediate execution. All crew members secure for temporal transition in 60 seconds. The storm reached peak intensity directly overhead. Lightning strikes occurring every few seconds with electrical energy that lit the entire mountain range. Dr. Peterson's lightning rod array captured and channeled each discharge, building toward the critical energy threshold needed to break 8 decades of temporal imprisonment. All stations ready for temporal reversal sequence," Dr. Peterson announced, her hand poised over the final activation switch. "Mountain Ghost Crew, prepare for return to April 1945. Ready for temporal reversal," Lieutenant Washington confirmed. "Whatever happens, thank you for trying to bring us home." The storm reached supernatural intensity as Dr. Peterson initiated the temporal reversal sequence. Lightning strikes occurred every 3 seconds with mathematical precision, each electrical discharge captured by the lightning rod array and channeled through electromagnetic field generators that hummed with barely contained energy. The temporal field generator, cobbled together from university physics equipment and components found in James's father's equipment caches, represented the culmination of 8 decades of scientific development applied to solving a 1940s problem. Copper coils, quantum field manipulators, and electromagnetic pulse generators worked in harmony to create conditions that could theoretically break the closed time-like curve holding the tank crew prisoner, temporal. "Field strength at 60% of threshold." Dr. Peterson called over the increasing wind and electrical activity. "Mountain Ghost Crew, report your status." "All crew secure," Lieutenant Washington responded from inside the tank. "Heidelberg's original equipment shows temporal field fluctuations beginning. We're experiencing minor chronometer displacement, time flow becoming irregular." James monitored the grounding cables that connected their improvised equipment to the mountain's granite bedrock, watching electrical energy flow through conductors that glowed with barely contained power. Each lightning strike sent massive surges through the system, building toward the critical energy level needed to reverse 79 years of temporal displacement. 80% of threshold, Dr. Peterson announced. Her voice strained as she managed equipment operating at the absolute limits of safety. "James, how are the grounding connections?" "Holding steady, but the cables are heating up beyond safe levels," he replied, watching copper conductors begin to glow red-hot from the electrical load. "I don't know how much more they can take." A massive lightning strike hit the array directly, sending energy surges through the temporal field generator that caused it to emit sounds James had never heard before. Harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate with the mountain itself. The air around the tank began shimmering with distortions that made reality appear liquid. 95%, Dr. Peterson called. "Crew, prepare for temporal transition initiation." The tank began showing signs of temporal instability as the displacement field weakened. The vehicle's edges became indistinct, flickering between solid presence and translucent outline. Inside, the crew reported experiencing rapid fluctuations in time flow, moments stretching into hours, then compressing into seconds. "Dr. Peterson," Lieutenant Washington's voice came through radio static that crackled with temporal interference. "We're experiencing rapid chronometer displacement. Time flow inside our vehicle is becoming chaotic. That's normal for temporal field collapse," she replied, watching readings that showed the displacement field reaching critical instability. "Maintain crew positions and prepare for final transition sequence." Another direct lightning strike overloaded one of the electromagnetic field generators, sending sparks and smoke into the storm-charged air. Dr. Peterson quickly rerouted power through backup systems while James replaced damaged grounding cables with spares from his father's equipment cache. Threshold achieved. Dr. Peterson announced, as the temporal field generator reached critical energy levels. Initiating temporal reversal sequence in 3, 2, 1. She activated the final sequence, sending a controlled electromagnetic pulse through the lightning rod array and into the displacement field surrounding the tank. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Reality around the summit began bending and shifting as 8 decades of accumulated temporal energy discharged in a carefully controlled cascade. The tank became translucent, then solid, then translucent again, as the crew experienced rapid transitions between their displaced state and normal spacetime. James could see the soldiers inside, flickering between their 1945 appearances and older versions that showed the effects of 79 years of aging, then back to their original states. Temporal field collapse proceeding normally, Dr. Peterson reported, watching data streams that showed the displacement field weakening with each electromagnetic pulse.
Crew status report.
Experiencing extreme temporal fluctuation, Lieutenant Washington replied, his voice distorted by the rapid changes in time flow. All crew members conscious but disoriented. Equipment shows decreasing displacement field strength. The storm began intensifying beyond anything James had experienced in 40 years of mountain climbing. Lightning strikes occurred continuously, creating a dome of electrical activity around the summit that turned night into day. The temporal field generator channeled each discharge into the reversal sequence, building toward complete collapse of the displacement field. Critical phase approaching, Dr. Peterson warned. The next 60 seconds will determine success or catastrophic failure. The tank began fading from view as the temporal reversal succeeded in returning the crew toward their original time period. But the process was far from stable. Reality around the summit flickered between multiple time periods as past, present, and future collided in the controlled collapse of the displacement field. At the exact moment Dr. Peterson's temporal field generator reached maximum output, Lieutenant Washington's wristwatch stopped at 14:23 on April 15, 1945. For 79 years, began ticking again. The sound cut through the electrical chaos like a heartbeat returning to life, marking the precise instant when the temporal displacement field began its final collapse. James watched in fascination as the tank commanders watch, visible through the translucent hull as reality shifted around them, showed its hands moving for the first time since the original displacement. The timepiece had been frozen at the moment of temporal capture, serving as a physical anchor to the crew's original time period. Temporal field collapse accelerating, Dr. Peterson announced, monitoring readings that showed the displacement matrix destabilizing rapidly. The chronometer reactivation indicates successful field penetration. Crew, prepare for rapid temporal transition. The watch continued ticking with mechanical precision, its movement synchronized with the electromagnetic pulses from the temporal field generator. Each tick marked another second of progress toward returning the crew to their proper place in history. But the process was far from stable. Dr. Peterson, Lieutenant Washington's voice came through increasing radio static. We're experiencing extreme temporal displacement. The crew is aging rapidly, then reverting to our original states, then aging again. Time flow inside our vehicle has become completely chaotic. James could see the effects through the tank's translucent hull. The 5 crew members flickered between their young 1945 appearances and elderly versions that showed 79 years of aging, then back to their original states in rapid succession. The temporal collapse was forcing them to experience all possible versions of their existence simultaneously. That's normal for field collapse, Dr. Peterson replied, though her voice carried concern as she watched readings that fluctuated beyond safe parameters. Your chronometer reactivation means the displacement field is weakening successfully. Maintain positions and let the reversal sequence complete. Another massive lightning strike hit the array, sending energy surges through the temporal field generator that caused it to emit harmonic frequencies that resonated with the mountain itself. The sound was unlike anything James had ever heard. Deep, resonant tones that seemed to come from the granite bedrock itself. The tank commander's watch continued its steady ticking, but James noticed something troubling. The timepiece was gaining speed, its hands moving faster than normal time flow. Whatever temporal forces were acting on the crew were affecting their relationship with time itself. Watch acceleration detected, Dr. Peterson observed, noting the same phenomenon. The temporal collapse is creating time dilation effects. The crew is experiencing accelerated time flow relative to our position. Dr. Peterson, came Lieutenant Washington's increasingly distorted voice, chronometer showing rapid advancement. Our time flow is accelerating beyond normal parameters. Are we aging at an increased rate? Negative, she replied quickly. The acceleration is confined to your temporal field collapse. Your biological processes remain synchronized with your subjective time experience. The watch acceleration indicates successful return to normal temporal flow. James watched the crew flicker more rapidly between their various temporal states. Young faces from 1945, aged features showing decades of displacement, then back to youth again. The temporal collapse was forcing them through every possible version of their existence as the displacement field weakened. Critical phase beginning, Dr. Peterson announced as her equipment reached maximum output. Field collapse entering final stage. Crew, prepare for temporal lock-in to your original time period. The watch on Lieutenant Washington's wrist began glowing with soft light that had no natural source. The timepiece was becoming a temporal beacon, drawing the crew back to their proper place in history through its connection to April 15th, 1945. Watch activation complete, Lieutenant Washington reported, his voice clearer now despite the increasing electrical chaos around them. Chronometer showing normal time advancement, crew experiencing stabilized temporal flow. The tank became more solid with each passing second as the displacement field collapsed around it. The crew stopped flickering between temporal states, settling into their original 1945 appearances as the reversal sequence reached completion. Temporal field collapse at 90%, Dr. Peterson called over the storm. Watch synchronization successful. Crew returning to baseline temporal state. James realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in human history, the successful reversal of temporal displacement, guided by a simple mechanical watch that had waited 79 years to resume its function. The timepiece had become the anchor that pulled 5 young soldiers back through time to the moment they belonged. Field collapse completion in 30 seconds. Dr. Peterson announced. Mountain Ghost Crew, prepare for final temporal transition. The commander's watch ticked steadily now, marking normal time as the crew prepared to return to a world that had moved on without them for nearly 8 decades. As the temporal field collapsed completely, a faded letter materialized on the granite beside James's position, yellowed paper that seemed to appear from thin air as the barriers between time periods weakened. The envelope bore a 1945 postmark and was addressed to Private Robert Johnson, 761st Tank Battalion, somewhere in Europe. James picked up the letter with trembling hands, recognizing the careful handwriting of someone who had spent considerable time crafting each word. The envelope had been opened and refolded many times, showing the wear patterns of a document treasured and reread countless times during long, lonely hours. Dr. Peterson, look at this, he called over the diminishing electrical activity. A letter just appeared out of nowhere. She glanced at the envelope while monitoring her equipment's readings as the temporal field generator powered down from its critical operation. Physical objects from 1945 are materializing as the temporal barriers collapse. The displacement field has been holding items in temporal suspension for 79 years. The letter's contents, visible through the worn paper, revealed intimate details of a life interrupted by war and temporal displacement. James could make out fragments. Bobby, your mother misses you terribly. The war news sounds encouraging. Your sister graduated high school and sends her love. Please come home safe. Mountain Ghost Crew. Dr. Peterson called to the tank, which was now fully solid and present in 2024. We're detecting materialization of temporal artifacts from your original time period. Personal items that were displaced along with your vehicle are returning to normal space-time. Lieutenant Washington's voice came through the radio with perfect clarity now, no longer distorted by temporal interference. Dr. Peterson, we're experiencing complete temporal stabilization. All crew members report normal time flow and stable physical condition. Are we back in our proper time? James looked around the summit, realizing that more than just the letter had materialized. Personal items scattered across the granite suggested the tank crew had been carrying mail, photographs, and mementos when they were displaced in 1945. These objects had existed in temporal suspension for 8 decades, finally released as the displacement field collapsed. Negative on time period return, Dr. Peterson replied carefully. You've been returned to normal temporal flow, but in 2024, not 1945, the displacement reversal brought you forward to our current time rather than backward to your original era. The implications of this revelation settled over the summit like a weight. The crew had been successfully rescued from temporal displacement, but they now faced the challenge of existing in a world that had moved on without them for nearly 8 decades. Dr. Peterson, came Private Johnson's young voice from the tank, does this mean our families, everyone we knew? I'm afraid most of your contemporaries would have passed away from natural causes, she replied gently. But you've been returned to normal time flow. You can age, live, build new lives in this era. The displacement is over. James examined the letter more closely, noting details that suggested the complex relationship between time and displaced objects. The paper showed aging consistent with 79 years of existence, but the ink remained perfectly legible. The letter had aged normally, while existing in temporal suspension. Lieutenant Washington, James called to the tank, we have personal mail that was displaced with your vehicle. Letters from home, family photographs, personal items that have been in temporal suspension since 1945. Mr. Crawford, sir, could you read some of the letters? We haven't had word from home since our displacement. Even if our families are gone, we'd like to know they remembered us. James opened the letter addressed to Private Johnson, reading words written by a mother who had no idea her son would disappear into temporal suspension for 8 decades. The message was filled with ordinary details of civilian life during wartime, rationing challenges, victory garden progress, neighborhood news, and endless expressions of love and hope for safe return. Your mother wrote about victory gardens and saving scrap metal for the war effort, James read aloud. She mentions that your sister Mary was accepted to nursing school and wants to help with the war effort. She says the whole neighborhood prays for your safe return every Sunday at church. The silence from the tank was profound as 5 young men processed news from families who had lived and died believing their sons, husbands and brothers were missing in action. The temporal rescue had succeeded, but it had brought them to a world where everyone they had known and loved was gone. Sir, Lieutenant Washington said finally, thank you for reading that. It helps to know our families cared and waited for us, even if we can never see them again. As the last effects of the temporal collapse faded, James noticed something extraordinary happening to the documents in his pack. The military service record he had carried up the mountain, originally showing the 5 crew members as missing in action, presumed dead, was changing before his eyes. New text appeared on the aged paper as history corrected itself in real time. The updated service record now showed complete information for all 5 crew members. Successfully completed classified reconnaissance mission, April 16, 1945, returned to base with valuable intelligence regarding enemy positions. Awarded Bronze Star for courage under fire. Discharged honorably, May 1945. Dr. Peterson, look at this, James said, showing her the transformed document. The historical records are updating themselves. The timeline is correcting to show their successful return in 1945. She examined the papers with fascination, watching military bureaucracy rewrite itself as the temporal paradox resolved. The temporal reversal is creating retroactive historical changes. Reality is adjusting to accommodate their successful mission completion in their original time period. Lieutenant Washington emerged from the tank's commander's hatch, moving with the careful motions of someone testing reality after 79 years of displacement. His crew followed, 5 young men in 1940s military uniforms stepping onto a 2024 mountain summit with expressions of wonder and profound relief. "Gentlemen," Dr. Peterson addressed them formally, "the temporal reversal was successful. You've been returned to normal time flow and integrated into the corrected historical timeline. According to these updated records, you completed your mission successfully and returned home in 1945. Private Johnson, still only 19 despite his 79 years of displacement, looked at the service record with tears in his eyes. "Ma'am, does this mean our families knew we made it home? Does this mean they didn't spend their lives wondering what happened to us?" "According to the corrected timeline, yes," James replied, checking other documents that continued updating themselves. "Your families received word of your safe return and heroic service. The military records show you were all decorated for your courage and completed your enlistments normally." The service record continued evolving, adding details about post-war lives that had never occurred, but now existed in the corrected timeline. Marriage records, employment histories, family information, entire lifetimes that had been created retroactively to resolve the temporal paradox. "Corporal Williams," James read from the updating document, married his sweetheart in 1946. Worked for the Postal Service for 35 years, raised 4 children. Died peacefully in 1987, survived by wife, children, and grandchildren. "But, sir," Corporal Williams interjected, "I'm standing right here. How can the records show I lived a full life and died in 1987? Dr. Peterson explained the temporal mechanics with the patience of someone who had spent decades studying theoretical physics. The timeline correction created alternate versions of yourselves who lived normal lives after completing your mission in 1945. Those versions existed in the corrected timeline while you remained displaced. Now that you've been returned to normal time flow, both versions coexist until temporal equilibrium is established." The implications were staggering. The 5 soldiers had been successfully rescued from temporal displacement. Their families had been spared decades of grief and uncertainty, and history had been corrected to show their heroic service. But the rescued crew now existed in a world where alternate versions of themselves had already lived complete lives. "What happens to us now?" Private Thompson asked, studying the service record that showed him founding a successful construction company after the war. "Do we replace the versions of ourselves who lived normal lives? The temporal correction will integrate your consciousness with your alternate timeline selves," Dr. Peterson explained. "You'll retain your memories of the displacement while gaining access to the experiences of your corrected timeline versions. In effect, you'll remember both the 79 years of displacement and the full lives you lived after returning from the war." James watched the 5 young soldiers process this information, understanding that their rescue was more complex than simply returning them to their own time. They had been given something unprecedented, the chance to experience both the displacement and the normal lives they should have lived. "The corrected timeline shows all of you lived full, successful lives," James added, reading from documents that continued updating with remarkable detail. "You returned home as heroes, built families, pursued careers, and contributed to your communities for decades. The temporal integration will allow you to experience those memories as if they had always been yours." Lieutenant Washington looked at his crew with the expression of a commander who had successfully brought his men home after an impossible mission. "Gentlemen, it appears our displacement is truly over. We're going home, and somehow we've already been there." As the storm cleared and normal weather patterns returned to Mount Revere, James took out his camera to document their successful rescue mission. When he reviewed the digital photograph on the camera's screen, he saw himself and Dr. Peterson standing on the summit with their equipment scattered around them, but no trace of the Sherman tank or its crew remained visible in the image. The photograph showed only two people on a rocky mountain peak, surrounded by the scattered remains of electromagnetic equipment and lightning rod arrays. Where the tank had sat for 79 years, the summit appeared completely normal, as if no military vehicle had ever existed at this location. "Dr. Peterson, look at this," James said, showing her the camera's display. "The photograph shows no evidence of the tank or the crew. It's as if they were never here." She examined the digital image with scientific curiosity, comparing it to her own visual memory of the summit just minutes before. "The timeline correction has erased all physical evidence of the displacement from our current reality. The tank and crew have been successfully integrated into their proper place in history." 1945. James took several more photographs from different angles, but each image showed the same thing: a normal mountain summit with no indication that anything extraordinary had occurred. The granite showed no marks where the tank had rested, no disturbance from the crew's 79 years of presence. "This means we have no proof of what happened here," James realized. "No evidence that the displacement occurred, no documentation of the rescue. Future hikers will find a completely normal summit with a standard register book. That's the nature of successful temporal correction," Dr. Peterson explained, packing her equipment with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved something unprecedented. "The timeline has been healed. The displacement that should never have occurred has been erased from reality, leaving only the corrected history where the crew completed their mission successfully." James checked the summit register box, finding it now contained decades of normal hiker entries dating back to the 1960s. Names, dates, weather conditions, and climbing experiences filled the logbook in the natural progression of mountain climbing activity. There was no gap, no missing period, no indication that anything had prevented hikers from reaching this summit for nearly 8 decades. "The register shows normal activity throughout the entire period when the tank was displaced," he observed, reading entries from hikers who had somehow reached the summit despite the presence of a 30-ton military vehicle. "Reality has adjusted itself to accommodate both the displacement and normal mountain climbing activity. Temporal mechanics creates whatever reality is necessary to resolve paradoxes," Dr. Peterson said, checking her own equipment that now showed completely normal electromagnetic readings for the summit. The corrected timeline includes both the crew's successful 1945 mission and uninterrupted civilian access to the mountain. James photographed the updated summit register, creating documentation of the corrected timeline, while losing all evidence of the displacement period. The images would show a mountain that had always been accessible to hikers, with no gap in the historical record. "What about our memories of the rescue?" James asked, suddenly concerned that the timeline correction might erase their own experiences. "Will we remember what happened here? We exist outside the corrected timeline because we initiated the temporal reversal," Dr. Peterson replied confidently. "Our memories of the displacement and rescue will remain intact, but we'll be the only ones who remember the original timeline. Everyone else will remember only the corrected history." James took one final photograph of the summit, creating an image that would show future viewers nothing more than two people who had successfully climbed Mount Revere. The electromagnetic equipment, lightning rod arrays, and all evidence of their temporal rescue mission appeared in the photograph as normal hiking gear. "This photograph will be the only evidence that we were here today," James said, reviewing the image that showed no trace of their extraordinary accomplishment. "Future generations will see two hikers who reached a summit, not two people who successfully rescued 5 soldiers from temporal displacement." "That's exactly how it should be," Dr. Peterson replied. The rescue was successful precisely because it erased itself from history. The crew is home, their families were spared grief, and the timeline has been corrected. The absence of evidence is proof of our success. James realized they had achieved something that would forever remain their secret, a successful manipulation of time itself that had corrected a historical injustice while leaving no trace of the extraordinary effort required to accomplish it. The photograph in his camera would show only a normal day on a normal mountain, hiding one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. 3 days after their return from Mount Revere, James was researching the corrected timeline when he discovered a newspaper clipping from the Denver Post, dated April 17, 1945. The yellowed paper, which he found in a box of his father's effects that he had searched through countless times before, contained an article that had never existed in the original timeline. The headline read, "Local tank crew returns from heroic reconnaissance mission." Below it, a photograph showed 5 young African-American soldiers standing beside their Sherman tank, decorated with bronze stars and surrounded by celebrating family members. Mountain Ghost Crew of the 761st Tank Battalion returned yesterday from a classified reconnaissance mission that provided crucial intelligence for Allied forces, the article began. Lieutenant James Washington, along with crew members Corporal Marcus Williams, Sergeant David Thompson, Private Thomas Anderson, and Private Robert Johnson, spent 3 days behind enemy lines gathering information about German defensive positions. James read the article with fascination, watching how the corrected timeline had created detailed explanations for the crew's 3-day absence. According to the new history, they had conducted a dangerous but successful scouting mission that contributed directly to Allied victory in Europe. The crew's commander, Lieutenant Washington, reported that the mission exceeded all expectations. The article continued. Their intelligence regarding enemy troop movements and defensive preparations proved invaluable to subsequent Allied operations. All 5 crew members have been recommended for commendation. Quotes from family members filled the rest of the article, expressing relief and pride at their loved one's safe return. Robert Johnson's mother was quoted as saying, "We prayed every day for Bobby's safety. When word came that he was missing for 3 days, we feared the worst. Having him home safe is the greatest blessing we could ask for." James contacted Sarah to verify the newspaper's authenticity, sending her digital photographs of the clipping. Her response confirmed what he suspected. The article was genuine 1945 newsprint, but she had no memory of ever seeing it before during her extensive research into their grandfather's military service. "Dad, this is extraordinary," she wrote in her email. "The article is definitely authentic period journalism, but I've been through every document in Grandpa's collection dozens of times. This newspaper clipping wasn't there before. It's as if it just appeared." The newspaper provided detailed information about the corrected timeline that resolved the temporal paradox. The crew had completed their mission successfully, returned to Allied lines with valuable intelligence, and been decorated for their service. Their families had experienced only 3 days of worry instead of decades of grief and uncertainty. According to this article, James read to Dr. Peterson over the phone, the crew's intelligence contributed to the successful Allied advance that led to Germany's surrender 3 weeks later. Their reconnaissance mission had direct strategic value for ending the war. The timeline correction created the most positive possible outcome, Dr. Peterson replied. Not only did the crew return safely, but their mission had genuine military value. The corrected history shows their displacement served a real purpose in achieving Allied victory. James found more evidence of the corrected timeline in unexpected places. Marriage announcements from 1946 showed Corporal Williams wedding his sweetheart as planned. Birth announcements from the late 1940s documented the children born to crew members who had returned safely from the war. Obituaries from decades later described full lives lived by men who had served their country with honor. The newspaper article is just one piece of a completely rewritten history. James told Dr. Peterson, the timeline correction created entire lifetimes for these men, complete with families, careers, and contributions to their communities. That's the nature of successful temporal manipulation, she replied. Reality doesn't just correct the immediate paradox. It creates whatever history is necessary to support the correction. The crew didn't just return home. They lived the full lives they should have lived. James carefully preserved the newspaper clipping, understanding it was one of the few pieces of evidence that proved their rescue mission had succeeded. While their own photographs showed no trace of the temporal displacement, this 1945 newspaper documented the positive outcome their intervention had created. The article represented something remarkable, proof that their efforts had not only rescued 5 young soldiers, but had given them the opportunity to live full, meaningful lives in their proper time period. The newspaper clipping was a testament to the power of temporal correction to heal historical injustices and restore the natural order of events. 5 young men who should have come home as heroes did come home as heroes, James reflected, reading the article one more time, just 79 years later than originally planned. 6 months after the rescue mission, James sat in his study updating his personal field journal with a complete account of the temporal rescue operation. The leather-bound notebook, which had served him faithfully through decades of geological surveys and mountain climbing expeditions, now contained the most extraordinary entry of his career, a detailed record of humanity's first successful temporal displacement reversal. Operation Mountain Phase Resolution, Complete Mission Report, read the heading he had written in careful script. Below it, James documented every technical detail, atmospheric condition, and equipment specification that had made the rescue possible. The journal entry spanned 47 pages, complete with diagrams, calculations, and observational notes that would allow future scientists to understand exactly what had been accomplished. The field journal contained information that existed nowhere else in recorded history. James had documented Dr. Peterson's electromagnetic field calculations, the atmospheric conditions required for temporal manipulation, and the precise sequence of events that had broken the closed time-like curve. The notebook represented the only comprehensive record of successful temporal rescue in human history. Dr. Peterson and I achieved what was considered theoretically impossible. James wrote in his final entry, "We successfully reversed temporal displacement, returned 5 soldiers to their proper place in history, and corrected a timeline that had been damaged by experimental science. The rescue required the coordination of 1940s theoretical physics, modern electromagnetic technology, and natural atmospheric phenomena that occur perhaps once in a generation." James had spent months verifying the success of their mission through careful research. The corrected timeline showed complete integration of the crew's return, with military records, family histories, and community contributions all reflecting their successful completion of the reconnaissance mission in 1945. The temporal correction created positive outcomes beyond the immediate rescue, he continued writing. The 5 crew members lived full lives, raised families, and contributed to their communities for decades after the war. Their families were spared the grief of permanent loss, and their service received the recognition it deserved. Dr. Peterson visited regularly to help him document the technical aspects of their achievement. Together, they had created a complete scientific record of temporal displacement theory, field manipulation techniques, and the atmospheric conditions required for successful reversal operations. Elizabeth has begun preliminary research into other possible temporal anomalies, James wrote. Our success on Mount Revere suggests that similar displacements might exist at other locations, where experimental science created unresolved paradoxes. The techniques we developed could potentially help other victims of temporal experimentation. The journal contained detailed maps of equipment cache locations, technical specifications for electromagnetic field generators, and atmospheric monitoring protocols that could guide future temporal rescue operations. James understood that their methods might be needed again if other temporal displacements were discovered. The moral implications of our success are profound, he reflected in his writing. We demonstrated that historical injustices can be corrected when technology and determination combine to address past wrongs. The 5 soldiers we rescued represented countless others who have suffered from experimental science conducted without adequate consideration of human consequences. James included careful analysis of the timeline correction process, documenting how reality had adjusted itself to accommodate both the original displacement and the successful rescue. The journal showed how temporal mechanics created whatever history was necessary to resolve paradoxes and restore natural cause and effect relationships. Our mission succeeded because we understood that temporal displacement is fundamentally about returning people to where they belong in history, he wrote. The technique we developed doesn't manipulate time for personal gain or scientific curiosity. It restores the natural order when experimental interference has created temporal injustice. The field journal represented more than just scientific documentation. It was James's personal testament to the importance of taking responsibility for past mistakes and working to correct historical wrongs. The rescue mission had transformed his understanding of what was possible when people committed themselves to helping others. Future researchers who discover this journal should understand that temporal manipulation carries enormous risks and moral responsibilities. James concluded his account. Our success was possible only because our intentions were pure. We sought to help others rather than advance our own interests. Temporal science must never be pursued without careful consideration of its impact on human lives. James closed the journal and placed it in his safe, understanding that someday other scientists might need the information it contained. The notebook represented humanity's first successful venture into temporal rescue, proving that even the most complex scientific problems could be solved when approached with proper preparation, adequate resources, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The journal would remain his personal record of the most meaningful accomplishment of his life, bringing 5 young soldiers home to the time where they belonged. 1 year after the rescue mission, James found an impossible letter in his mailbox, cream-colored paper with elegant handwriting and a postmark from April 18, 1945. The envelope was addressed to James Crawford, Mount Revere, present day, in script that belonged to an era when penmanship was considered an art form. Inside, 5 signatures confirmed what James had dared to hope but never expected to see. A thank you letter from the rescued crew, written immediately after their successful return to 1945 and somehow delivered across 79 years to reach him in 2024. Dear Mr. Crawford. The letter began in Lieutenant Washington's careful handwriting. We hope this letter finds you well in whatever time you call the present. Dr. Peterson explained that our rescue brought us back to 1945 while leaving you in 2024, but we wanted to express our gratitude, regardless of the temporal distance between us. James read the letter with hands that trembled slightly, understanding he was holding communication that had traveled through time itself to reach him. The paper felt authentic, aged but preserved, with the texture and weight of 1940s stationery. Your father, Sergeant William Crawford, helped us understand what had happened during our displacement, the letter continued. He explained that you and Dr. Peterson risked your lives to bring us home, using science we cannot pretend to understand, but will never forget. Please know that our families have been told of your courage and sacrifice. The crew had included individual messages, each reflecting their personality and gratitude. Private Johnson wrote, Sir, my mother asked me to tell you that she prays for your safety every day, even though she doesn't know exactly when you live. She says anyone who helps bring soldiers home deserves a mother's blessing. Corporal Williams added, Mr. Crawford, I wanted you to know that your father spent 3 days with us after our return, helping us understand what we had experienced. He is a good man who carried the burden of our displacement for years. Please tell him we hold no blame for what happened. The letter provided confirmation that the timeline correction had succeeded completely. The crew had integrated smoothly into 1945, completing their military service and transitioning to civilian life with full awareness of their temporal rescue experience. We have been sworn to secrecy about the technical aspects of our displacement, Lieutenant Washington explained, but we wanted you to know that our families understand we owe our lives to people from the future who refused to abandon us. The official records show we completed a reconnaissance mission, but we know the truth is far more remarkable. James realized the letter represented something unprecedented in human experience. Communication across time that proved the success of temporal manipulation. The crew had found a way to send gratitude through the decades, creating a bridge between their corrected 1945 timeline and his 2024 reality. Dr. Peterson will be fascinated by this, James murmured, studying the postmark that showed impossible delivery logistics. The letter had somehow navigated 79 years of postal service to reach him exactly 1 year after the rescue mission. Private Thompson's contribution focused on the broader implications. Sir, we hope our rescue encourages you to help others who might be trapped by forces beyond their control. The techniques you developed saved our lives, but more importantly, they proved that people can overcome any obstacle when they refuse to abandon those who need help. The letter concluded with a message that brought tears to James's eyes. Mr. Crawford, we know you cannot visit us in 1945, and we cannot visit you in 2024, but please understand that our gratitude spans all the years between our times. Somewhere in the corrected timeline, 5 soldiers lived full lives because you and Dr. Peterson had the courage to attempt the impossible. Below the final message, all 5 crew members had signed their names with the careful formality of men who understood the historic significance of their communication. With eternal gratitude across time itself, they had written, the crew of Mountain Ghost. James placed the letter carefully in his safe beside his field journal, understanding that he now possessed both the technical record of humanity's first temporal rescue and personal confirmation from the rescued soldiers themselves. The letter proved that their mission had succeeded beyond all expectations. That evening, he called Dr. Peterson to share the remarkable communication. Her response captured the magnitude of what they had accomplished. James, we didn't just rescue 5 soldiers from temporal displacement. We proved that justice can span any distance, overcome any obstacle, and heal any wound when people refuse to abandon those who need help. The letter from 1945 had arrived in 2024 to deliver a simple but profound message. Heroism transcends time. Gratitude knows no boundaries, and the courage to help others creates connections that last forever.